Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary Podcast is for you.
Welcome to the Spybrary Podcast. I'm David Clark. I'm a member of the Spybrary community, and I'm hosting today's broadcast. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Tim Tate, who is the author of a new book called To Catch a Spy: How the Spycatcher Affair Brought MI5 in from the Cold. I enjoyed this book enormously. I must say it's one of the best non-fiction espionage books I've read, and it's an absolutely thrilling read, full of detail, and brought back a lot of memories for me because I played my own very small part, as did many others, in the Spycatcher Affair by being among those who read a copy of the book brought back by a relative from America at a time when it still couldn't be published in the UK or even mentioned really in any detail in the British media. So I recall vividly the period and the drama around it, and the book really, I think, captures that brilliantly, but also adds a lot of detail about what was actually going on that was not known at the time, that I think really puts it into important context. So congratulations on that, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me and for those very kind comments.
For the benefit of those who weren't around at the time, either too young or maybe hadn't even been born at the time, could you perhaps just recap and explain what the Spycatcher Affair was and why it was such a pivotal and important moment in modern British history?
Sure. Essentially, between 1985 and 1991, the British government fought a succession of court cases in courts across the world, and they were attempting to suppress, to have banned, the memoirs of a former MI5 officer, Peter Wright. Wright had worked for 20 years for MI5 as its most senior mole hunter, if you want to put it that way, spycatcher in counterintelligence and counterespionage. And after his retirement, some years after his retirement, he decided he wanted to write his memoirs, Spycatcher, as the book became. The British government, cut a long story short, decided it didn't want him to do that and launched this tsunami of litigation. Primarily, the prime trial was in Australia, which was where Peter Wright was living at the time, but it also launched court cases in New Zealand, Hong Kong, and in London, and got caught up in litigation in Strasbourg as well. And spoiler alert, all of this vastly protracted, vastly expensive, and hugely damaging litigation, damaging in public relations terms and in financial costs, was lost by the British government. It lost every last battle it fought, and the book eventually didn't just appear, but became a global blockbuster. It sold 4 million copies worldwide. That, in a nutshell, was ostensibly what the Spycatcher Affair was about. What my book does is go behind the scenes and says, that's to some extent the official history you know. This is the secret history which you don't.
One of the things I've never really understood at the time or even since is why Thatcher was so obsessed with preventing the publication of this book, even after the point at which the revelations contained in it had already become very widely known, not least to the UK's enemies, if not to the British public initially anyway. No conceivable damage really could have been done, but it seemed that they were obsessed with, if you like, establishing a precedent that the government would be able to stop former intelligence officers from talking about their experiences. But the horse had gone long after the stable door was being bolted. So in a way that the amount of political capital that they expended on this seems wholly irrational in relation to anything they could conceivably have achieved by going down this course.
Yeah, I agree with you, every word of that, absolutely. The ostensible reason, and this is the official history, is that Thatcher and her most loyal and devoted servant, the Cabinet Secretary Sir Robert Armstrong, decided that they had to stop this book to prevent not just Peter Wright, but other Peter Wrights, any former intelligence officer, from publishing what he or she had learnt during the course of their employment with MI5, MI6, or I suppose GCHQ as well. And that was the official and ostensible reason. Realistically, and in reality, it was nonsense. MI5 officers particularly, and some MI6 officers, had not just published books before, not just given on-the-record interviews, but had appeared on camera, full face, on television, all before Thatcher and Armstrong and the British government launched this litigation. So the notion that MI5 officers owed, as Thatcher claimed, an unbreakable duty of confidence and confidentiality to the government and or the Crown was nonsense, because it had never, ever applied. Which, as you say, raises the question, why was she so determined to stop Peter Wright from publishing? And that's where it gets a lot more murky, because files which were suppressed, official files which were suppressed until New Year's Eve last year from the period, reveal that Thatcher lied to Parliament about some of the most damaging MI5 espionage scandals of the 50s and 60s, and that, crucially, she and Armstrong, her cabinet secretary, cooked up a grubby little scheme to leak some of those terribly important secrets to a tame journalist, government-friendly journalist, 5 years before the Spycatcher litigation began. And it was Thatcher and Armstrong were determined that this should not emerge. What happened as a result of that, and we're jumping quite far ahead of ourselves, I know, is that Sir Robert Armstrong, the government's cabinet secretary, the most senior civil servant in the British state, gave evidence in the main Australian trial under oath, on oath, and lied on oath. He wasn't, in his own famous phrase, merely economical with the truth. He told direct lies, and that is perjury. That's a criminal offence. And I think you have to factor all that secret history, all that background, and a great deal more, which I'm sure we'll come to, into the story to understand why Thatcher and Armstrong were so determined to silence Peter Wright.
It's an interesting example of the kind of the Streisand effect of because all of these things would never have come to light really if they hadn't gone down this entirely self-destructive route of trying and failing to prevent publication of this book in the Australian courts.
I mean, that's absolutely true to a point, but one of the oddities, and there are so many oddities in this story, is that just about everything in Wright's memoirs, in Spycatcher, had been published before. So there was even less point to doing this, to launching this litigation, this doomed litigation. As you say, the Streisand effect then comes into play. The publishers, and I interviewed the publisher of the book, the Australian publisher, and he said, we never thought this was going to make much dent in public interest. We thought we might sell about 20,000 copies, if we're lucky, worldwide. Well, because of what Thatcher and the British government did, the book sold 4 million copies worldwide. So they achieved, as they did in everything they tried in this saga, the polar opposite of everything they were setting out ostensibly to achieve.
And also an example of how one lie can lead to another, because it was Margaret Thatcher misleading the House of Commons over her statement about the revelations on Anthony Blunt that angered Peter Wright into a position where he wanted to start talking publicly about what had happened. Likewise with her misleading statement about Sir Roger Hollis and the allegations that he, the former head of MI5, had been a Soviet penetration agent, which then led to them colluding to leak details of that to a journalist, involving Peter Wright actually, and some of the information that he was supplying. They were tacitly involved in him leaking information at that point, and then it sort of steamrollers into lies in front of the Australian court by Sir Robert Armstrong, and ultimately more lies by Margaret Thatcher about the plot to unseat Harold Wilson, which happened later on. So this whole thing can snowballs really out of control, and it's an extraordinary thing to have experienced at the time. But it seems that we didn't really know the full story then, which is brought to light in your book in a very compelling way. I'd like to talk about some of the character. One of the things I really think makes your book work is the character, the cast list of characters involved in this. It's so colourful and vividly drawn by you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of them. Peter Wright is really himself at the centre of this. Obviously, he's the catalyst for the whole affair, and he's a real paradox as a human being. He's a whistleblower, but not unlike other whistleblowers of that period, like Clive Ponting and Sarah Tisdale, a sympathetic figure in many ways, because he's blowing the whistle himself. I mean, he's calling out illegal acts committed by MI5, which he was instrumental in orchestrating personally. So he was kind of implicating himself in blowing the whistle, as well as the organisation for which he worked and the politicians and civil servants who turned a blind eye to it. So he's a paradoxical figure.
He is, in my view, not just paradoxical. He is probably the most unlikely whistleblower you could ever imagine. Wright was both virulently right-wing, I mean, seriously right-wing. He was of a common mind in that regards with Thatcher. Again, an irony. He had, as you say, not just been at the heart of almost all of these spy scandals and therefore knew about them firsthand, but he had broken the law himself routinely. In his famous phrase, "We bugged and burgled our way across London at the behest of the state, while pompous bowler-hatted civil servants looked the other way." And all of that is undoubtedly true. And they got away with it because MI5 didn't officially exist at that point, and therefore felt free to ignore the law of the land.
I seem slightly differently now, having read your book. I must say, at the time, I sort of saw him as a sort of bit of a reactionary throwback in many ways, and his physical demeanour was he was bent and withered and wrinkled and so on. He didn't there was nothing glamorous about him at all. But having read his the backstory of him and the things that he's had to struggle with, his possibility of going to Cambridge University taken away by his father's unemployment, the near poverty that he experienced, having to work his way up through his own efforts to achieve any kind of position in life, the valuable work actually that he did in many ways in improving the UK's technical intelligence capabilities. And then ultimately the sort of the end point of this really of his public service career. He's horribly betrayed over his pension rights when MI5 went back on a gentleman's agreement that his pension entitlement from his earlier civil service job would be carried over, and then wasn't, which left him seriously struggling in old age. Puts him in a very different light for me, and I just wonder whether, how should he be seen as a figure in posterity? Do you think?
I think the word you used, a paradox, pretty much sums it up. Like I was a journalist, a youngish journalist at the time of the Spycatcher saga, and my instinctive view of him from everything which was being published was that this is really, this is not a good man. This is a man who is a reactionary, who is an anti-communist obsessive. And all of that's true. But, and I should say that was the view of the Labour Party, which was the opposition in Parliament at the time. But when you dig deep, as I did, into the previously closed secret files which had been kept secret for 40 plus years, plus Wright's own court testimony in the Australian trial, the secret elements of that, his testimony, which was in part never heard in public because the British government insisted that it shouldn't be. I managed to get hold of that secret testimony. When you put all of that together, when you delve into the background, into the secret history of this, suddenly the picture shifts. The image of Wright as this obsessive mole hunter with a bee in his bonnet about communist penetration, Soviet penetration of the British establishment, of politics, of MI5 and MI6, suddenly it takes on a new colour, because I found page after page of internal MI5 and some government documents which had either been misfiled or had been suppressed for decades, and which show that, to a very large extent, his arguments about Soviet penetration were largely justified. In his secret court testimony, which I can understand why the government insisted it was kept secret, because it was damning for the British government. In his secret court testimony, he said, at the end of my investigations, and that's 20 years of officially mandated investigations, he said, I came to the conclusion that the British establishment was rotten to the core with Russian agents. And you think, at first blush, you think, really? Is this really likely? And then you dig into these files, these previously secret, in some cases still secret files, and you say, well, look, here's the evidence, name after name, piece of evidence after piece of evidence. At the very least, there is a prima facie case for what he's arguing.
I felt the same way. I mean, I thought you set out the facts on that and very, very well and in a very accessible way. We'll come on to that in a little bit, really. But I think you're right on that, and it does just go to show that institutions are their reaction to these things is often to prevent institutional damage rather than to solve the problem that's caused the issue in the first place. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. I just want to talk about two other figures who feature in your book, who I think really are at the heart of the story and make it so compelling. The other is Chapman Pincher, who played a role in surfacing Peter Wright's allegations initially under his own name in a book called Their Trade is Treachery. Well-known intelligence commentator at the time, former Daily Express intelligence and defence correspondent. He was a very famous figure in the British media in that period of the 1980s. He seemed to be playing a double game, didn't he, really? He was he was both a dirt digger and a source of nuisance to the authorities, but also he was allowed himself, in order, I think, for quite mercenary reasons, to try and get an exclusive ahead of other people, into a scheme concocted by Robert Armstrong and Margaret Thatcher to leak details of the allegations against Roger Hollis on terms that would be most favourable to them. So how should we see him? Is his role as sinister and as I'm suggesting there?
Yes. Short answer, absolutely. Pincher was a veteran journalist, and to anyone in journalism, and indeed to the public at the time, he was Mr. Spy Story. He was the person who broke intelligence stories, wrote best-selling intelligence non-fiction books. He was the doyen, certainly in his own mind, of intelligence writers at the time. He was also, simultaneously, a deeply, I won't use the word corrupt, but a deeply dishonest man, a man whose prime interest was Chapman Pincher and serving his own interests. It matters little what I think, but every time I had to deal with Pincher's material or material about Pincher, I felt like I wanted to take a shower after going through it. The man was so loathsome. He was, again, virulently right-wing. He was dishonest. He cheated Wright out of his fair share of proceeds of the book. They collaborated on Pincher's Their Trade is Treachery. He gets involved in the two grubby little conspiracies to leak the Hollis details on terms favourable to the government. And beneath all of that, he was, according to Wright in the secret court testimony which I obtained, he was an MI5 asset. Now, there are so many plates being spun and little games being played behind the scenes that it's little wonder that eventually it came back to bite them.
In preparation for this, I read Chapman Pincher's last iteration of his summary of the case against Roger Hollis and the Great Conspiracy called Treachery. I don't know if you've read that book, but one thing that left a really nasty taste in the mouth and I felt was deeply dishonourable is the way that he repeatedly attacked Peter Wright in that work, saying that the only reason Roger Hollis ever got away with what he did, what he's alleged to have done anyway by Chapman Pincher, was because Peter Wright dropped the ball and wasn't a competent counterintelligence officer. So I thought, well, given everything that Peter Wright had done to help Chapman Pincher and build Pincher's celebrity at that time, I just thought it was deeply dishonourable for him to take that line of attack.
The man was profoundly dishonest.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read his own self-serving account of the Spycatcher trials, which he published, it is so dishonest and so transparently dishonest that it's hard to understand, for me at least, how any editor let it through, because it was so bogus. When we talk about Pincher, this is a man who for 20-something years had set out his stall as, I'm the person you come to, the journalist you come to, if you want to leak embarrassing secrets. And he did so because he had a vast expense account, and he lunched people, civil servants and politicians, at expensive restaurants, all on a background basis, so their names were never published, and Pincher thereafter claimed the credit. I think it was the historian E.P. Thompson that described Pincher as a public urinal where officials queued up to leak. And Pincher loved that. Pincher said, sure, I'm urinal. anyone can come in and leak in my urinal, provided they've got something sizable to leak. The truth is that his urinal was only open to the right wing in political terms. He would not consider anything from the centre or the centre-left. And what he was publishing was so embellished and so dishonest that, any time you see an allegation which is sourced to Pincher, you need to check the source, because it may not even exist.
The third character that I think is really interesting in this is Victor Rothschild, who has been in the corner of my eye. I've read a lot of material about the British intelligence in the period from the 1930s through to the end of the Cold War. And he's somebody that comes up repeatedly. He was a friend to everyone, seemed to have a finger on every pie. He'd been at Cambridge in the 30s. He'd known Anthony Blunt and Kim Philby and
Guy Burgess.
He recruited Blunt into MI5, and I think he'd recruited some other people who then turned out to be Soviet agents into various different capacities in British intelligence during the Second World War. And yet he never ever seemed to attract any suspicion. I was not really fully aware of the sort of extent of his involvement with so many of these different figures. Even as late as the 1980s, he's in discussions with Margaret Thatcher about taking over either as head of MI5 or MI6, or taking on some new intelligence supremo role, and this is being seriously considered. I've sort of always kind of avoided, I suppose, looking too closely, because I'm so put off by all those awful lurid conspiracy theories that attract themselves to the Rothschild name, that I've sort of almost sort of given him a pass, but as a result of that. But he's really a remarkable figure, and even Peter Wright still trusts him at the end.
If anyone had a reason not to trust Victor Rothschild, it should have been Peter Wright.
Indeed. So I just wonder why he managed to carry on through right from the 1930s right into the 1980s, playing this role and having all of these connections, and never really seeming to damage him in any way.
I think, just as a brief recap, we should just say, as you did, Rothschild knew and was on very friendly terms with many of the members of the canonical Ring of Five. He recruited some of them into the intelligence services, recommended others for intelligence and defense and highly sensitive posts. He himself was an MI5 officer during the war, a very brave MI5 officer during the war, specializing in bomb disposal, amongst other things. And then from the end of the war onwards, after he ostensibly left the intelligence services, he continues to work for them. He continues to work for MI5. He runs an agent inside Iran on behalf of MI6. And he's simultaneously inserting himself into almost every facet of political and important industrial scientific life. As you say, his fingers were in many pies. Wright put it rather more floridly. He said there are few threads of the British establishment which haven't had the Rothschild needle weaving through them. And yet, as you said, somehow he appeared to have escaped scrutiny. And then I found some files which were released in October 2022. MI5 released its first tranche of files on Victor Rothschild, ending in the period at the end of 1972. And lo and behold, what they showed is that he hadn't escaped scrutiny. For 10 years, MI5 suspected him, at the very least, of being a fellow traveller of the communist rings, spy rings, in the 1930s and beyond. They were absolutely sure that his wife, his second wife, Tess Rothschild, had been either an overt or covert communist in Cambridge in the 1930s. Those files, those MI5 files, which are at the National Archives, are incredibly revealing about what the security service finally twigged onto. And there are these agonized internal memos going back and forth saying, at the very least, he's not been honest with us. He's concealed stuff. At the very worst, he could well be suspected of being a Soviet agent. And yet, simultaneously, with the blessing of MI5's management, Peter Wright was sharing all the details of his investigation into the Rings of Five and Soviet penetration with Victor and Tess Rothschild. It was madness.
He played a role both in putting Chapman Pincher and Peter Wright together initially for the publication of their treatise Treachery, and then in encouraging Peter Wright to publish under his own name when the results of that book by Chapman Pincher were deemed by Peter Wright not to have met the mark, really.
Yeah.
So he's right at the heart of this affair. And then when his role in this becomes public or threatens to become public, he tries to remove himself from the whole affair and deny any involvement.
Well, I mean, I think I caught you about to say what I believe is right. When his role in the whole saga gets exposed, and people, and that's people like me, journalists and indeed politicians, start asking questions about how come Victor Rothschild hasn't felt the long arm of the law. What Rothschild does is attempt to blackmail Downing Street into giving him protection. And you'd think, well, that sounds a bit far-fetched. But then in these files, the prime ministerial files, which were rather belatedly and somewhat mysteriously released on New Year's Eve last year, there it is in black and white. There's Robert Armstrong saying, Rothschild's come in and he said this, and he's trying to warn us off because if he finds himself in the crosshairs of a police investigation, well, he'll reveal other stuff which we wouldn't want revealed. It was blackmail, pure and simple.
Yeah. I want to talk about the really big scandals that Spycatcher I think brought to light or at least gave much greater prominence to. Obviously, one we've touched on already is the allegation about Sir Roger Hollis and the investigation into him, and that despite official denials that he was a Soviet agent and indeed misleading statements that he'd been cleared, which it appears not to be the case, of being a Soviet agent. It seems to me that the reasons for suspecting him have never really been effectively rebutted. I mean, Christopher Andrews' official biography of MI5 I've read, and initially I when I read it I thought, well, that seems to be pretty conclusive. Mm-hmm. But then when I went back and looked at the material, looked at the allegations that Peter Wright had made in detail in your book, I looked again at the things that Chapman Pincher says in his various works. Andrews doesn't really even scratch the surface of rebutting the full panoply of reasons for suspecting Roger Hollis, which are really extraordinarily extensive.
Absolutely. Again, for anyone who doesn't know, Hollis, career MI5 officer from before the Second World War, rose to become Director General of MI5 from the late 50s through to 1963. And he was the subject of MI5's biggest and most damaging internal mole hunt. There was an official internal working party called the Fluency Committee, which investigated him and the allegations against him that he was a Soviet agent. Now, that is unprecedented. The head of MI5 being investigated as a Soviet spy. Fluency, which was led by Peter Wright, producing 3 reports, all of which said unanimously, yeah, we believe that on the balance of probability, Hollis was a Soviet agent. There was a further internal committee, a subsequent committee, which produced a report which said exactly the same thing. After that, and this is where the cover-up begins, the former cabinet secretary, a man called Lord Burke-Trend, was commissioned by Downing Street to conduct another inquiry and produce another report. And he did so. He spent a year doing this, interviewing as many of the relevant officers as he could, and going through the material which indicated Hollis might have been a traitor. And for clarity, there were 28 separate pieces of intelligence which indicated that he might be a Soviet agent. Trend's report, which was finished and delivered to the government in 1975, has never been published. Never. And when Thatcher was forced in 1981, after Pincher and Wright, with the help of Wright, had exposed the existence of the investigation into Hollis, after Thatcher was forced to get on her hind legs in the House of Commons and make a statement, she said that Hollis had been cleared. She said Lord Trend's report had found that he was not, and she emphasised this heavily if you listen to the audio from the conference, he was not a spy. And that's the official version to this day. It's the one that's in Christopher Andrews' official history of MI5. It's the one that's in all the history books. There's a problem with that. In those files which mysteriously arrived in the National Archives on New Year's Eve 2023, there are 2 internal memos from Sir Robert Armstrong, Cabinet Secretary, to Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister. And he said what Lord Trend actually concluded was that it was 80% probable that Hollis had not been a spy, and therefore it was 20% possible that he had been a spy. Now that is completely at odds with Thatcher's ringing pronouncement that Hollis had been cleared. And if you ask me, I'm not an intelligence officer. I would never have aspired to be one, nor would I have ever been recruited as one. If you ask me, the possibility that there is a 1 in 5 chance that the former head of MI5 was a Soviet agent is pretty damn serious.
It is, and it would be disqualifying, and indeed was disqualifying for many lesser figures in public life and in civil service positions who were denied promotions or in some cases sacked for connections that were far more tenuous than those that attracted suspicion to Roger Hollis or Victor Rothchild, for that matter. They seem to belong to a sort of a charmed circle of people to whom a different standard was applied.
Absolutely right. And I think what not just brings this up today, but I think it gives it the story a certain impetus. That information wasn't just covered up for more than 40 years. It wasn't just quietly released to the National Archives on New Year's Eve last year, after I had been trying to get at it for 3 years, I point out. That information was withheld from the Spycatcher trial. Wright's lawyer, Malcolm Turnbull, an incredibly able young Australian lawyer who went on to become Prime Minister of Australia somewhat. Wright's lawyer, Turnbull, suspected that information existed, and he wanted to get hold of it, and he applied in discovery, as the legal process is called, for all of that paperwork. And the government refused. It simply disobeyed, ignored, and rejected court orders to hand over all of those documents. In the end, Turnbull was forced to compromise just to keep the trial on track and never got hold of them. And I found within these belatedly released files little notes going back and forth between Downing Street and the government's Australian legal team saying this information cannot be disclosed. It cannot be discovered. We mustn't let this happen. Why? Because it showed that Thatcher lied to the Commons and indeed that Armstrong lied to the court.
Just summarising on the Roger Hollis thing, I mean, I myself, was astonished by the breadth and volume of the connections that pointed towards Hollis's guilt, but I also could see that there were also good reasons for doubting it. So for me, the case for and against is still in the balance. But one of the things I found really fascinating was the insight into the sort of wilderness of mirrors, world of counterintelligence investigations, and the on the one hand, Peter Wright is saying, well, there were all these MI5 operations that were blown. We didn't have any success against the Soviets for years and years and years. And when we did have success, those successes were tainted by signs of Soviet interference, suggestive of a mole. So MI5's lack of success was evidence of a mole. But then he says, after the defection of Mikhail Golunevsky in 1961, he points to the fact that Golunevsky had revealed that it was standard Soviet practice to allow some of their agents to be captured in order to protect more important agents. And then he goes and says, well, this just shows that the arrest of the Portland spy ring was a deception operation to protect somebody higher up. So even MI5's successes at that point became evidence of penetration. So it was a kind of topsy-turvy world in which anything and everything, if you looked at it from a certain angle, could be seen as evidence of penetration or deception by the enemy.
I think that's absolutely right. I likened it, and still do, to a Rorschach test. Counterintelligence is a Rorschach test. This ink blot looks like something to one person, but can look like something completely opposite to the next person in the next room. You mentioned Golunevsky, and I wrote the first biography of Golunevsky, which came out a couple of years ago. And like Peter Wright in some ways, an extraordinary character, even more extraordinary perhaps personally than Wright. But whatever else is true about Mikhail Golunevsky, he was probably the most important spy inside Soviet bloc intelligence for the West in the early to middle Cold War period. I mean, he exposed 1,600 Soviet agents, penetration agents worldwide. It's never been repeated. And yes, he did warn MI5 after he defected. He said, it is KGB policy, if needed, to sacrifice a pawn to protect a king or a queen. If you factor that into the Rorschach test, yes, the Portland spy rings, the ease with which the leaders of the Portland spy ring were captured does begin to look suspicious, but that's only one tiny piece of the evidence which Wright and the Fluency Committee and everybody and all the other subsequent committees assembled. Is that evidence on Hollis utterly watertight? Absolutely not. No, it isn't. It is the balance of probability in the end. 80%, 20%, as Trend reported it. I think Wright, which it best that what he said is, in cases of this kind, I think the country should be given the benefit of the doubt, not the individual.
I think we're never really going to know the truth until the day, which may be very far off, when we get access to the GRU files in Moscow.
I think that there's a much simpler and much quicker way to clear this up, if almost clear it up, perhaps. The government today, which has no loyalty to the Thatcher era or its predecessors, could release the Trend Report. It's never been released. MI5 could release its files on the Fluency Committee and its investigation. They haven't. In my view, they should.
Can I ask very quickly about the other major scandal, which I don't want to sort of bypass, which is the plot against Harold Wilson, which Peter Wright was closely involved in. Firstly, why were the conspiracists within the British establishment, including the intelligence services, so convinced that Wilson was in some way under Soviet influence? And secondly, were the moves against him just, as one person put it, sort of idle talk by gin-soaked generals in the gentlemen's clubs, or did it amount to a serious anti-constitutional plot?
MI5 had been interested in Wilson since he was president of the Board of Trade in the Attlee government. Attlee ordered that Britain should sell some advanced jet engines to the Soviet Union, and that attracted MI5's interest. Wilson was handy to blame in that sense because he handled it on behalf of Attlee. Thereafter, and in the years after that, Wilson did collect around himself a coterie of not terribly honest Eastern European origin businessmen who did vast sums of business with the Soviet bloc, and that each of those individuals, whose details are in my book, attracted MI5's interest with varying degrees of justification. What really kick-started the whole interest is the arrival of this thoroughly dubious defector from the Soviet intelligence system, Anatoly Golitsyn, who arrives and is given the red carpet treatment by the CIA's legendary and Machiavellian head of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton. And Golitsyn said, well, you've just had the leader of the Labour Party die in what might appear mysterious circumstances. That was Hugh Gateskill, died a few months after coming back from a meeting in the Kremlin. And I know, said Golitsyn, that the Soviet intelligence offed him. They killed him, and they did so to put Harold Wilson in place because Harold Wilson is a Soviet spy. There was not a shred of evidence to support this. There was very rarely a shred of evidence to support anything, Golitsyn said, but it found favour. MI5 begins collecting evidence. Files begin to build up. Wilson is given a couple of code names, Oatchief or Harold John Worthington, Norman John Worthington. And the files begin to build up. Fast forward to 1974, when Wilson's back in office, and it's a difficult time politically. The 70s weren't easy. And Wright and a coterie, a cabal, if you want, of around 30 MI5 officers began to plot. And what they plotted, and this is Wright's own confession, if you like, was to get hold of MI5's files on Wilson from the registry deep beneath MI5. And to go to Wilson, Wright was to go to Wilson and say, look at all this material we've got on you. If you don't resign, we will leak it to the press. Was that just a few gin-soaked, old, discontented MI5 officers? Well, it was that, but it was also deadly serious. A serving MI5 officer, a group of serving MI5 officers, plotting to blackmail the Prime Minister and force him to resign. I don't think it gets much more serious than that.
And they held their meetings in MI5's headquarters.
They did
I mean, so the statement that Thatcher was forced to make off the back of the Spycatcher Affair, basically saying that there was no plot, there was never anything serious, Harold Wilson was never bugged, all this is just wrong. I mean, she completely lied to the House in that statement.
Yeah, I mean, Thatcher had a lengthy and dishonourable history of lying to the House on intelligence matters. And the Wilson plot was, I think, one of the clearest examples at the time. She said the head of MI5, the new head of MI5 at the time, assured me that there was no such plot and there are no such files. Well, even at the time, that was nonsense, because not just Wright, but a number of very senior MI5 and indeed MI6 officers had gone on record saying there were files, there was this plot. And that those files existed then and exist now, is a fact. Thatcher simply lied.
Well, we could talk about that for a long time. Well, that should ought to be a podcast in itself, really. So maybe we should think about doing that at some stage. But we have limited time, and there are a few questions that I'm really very keen to ask. So if we could go through them quickly, just so that we can get brief answers and wrap this up within the allotted time. First of all, I'd like to obviously Spycatcher Affair was a huge catalyst for intelligence service reform. Interestingly, the MI5 at that point, the Spycatcher Affair, I think, started to impinge on MI5's operational efficiency because officers were refusing to do things for which they were now realizing they had no proper legal cover, and therefore the case for putting MI5 on a statutory basis became unanswerable at that point. Do you think the reforms of that time went far enough? Do you think something like the Spycatcher Affair could still happen, or the revelations raised by the Spycatcher Affair? And what do you think it would look like if it did?
It's the what ifs are always a really tricky area for journalists and historians as well. The Spycatcher Affair unquestionably accelerated the drive to put MI5 not just on a statutory basis, to make it lawfully exist and therefore bring its officers under legal control, but thereafter to bring it under some form of parliamentary scrutiny. Did that go far enough? Well, it certainly didn't go far enough at the time. In my view, it doesn't go far enough now. You know, there's an example from the States, and MI5 was then and still is beholden in many ways to US intelligence for a great deal of its support and information. And the US intelligence community has been scrutinized by congressional committees for decades. There is no reason for that not to be thoroughly explored here. We do have now, thanks to Spycatcher, some parliamentary scrutiny, but it's limited and it's not terribly transparent. I think there's a case for it being far more transparent.
One of the central themes or issues of the Spycatcher Affair was this idea that Thatcher was obsessed by, that spies had a lifetime duty of both a duty of secrecy, that they
It's more enforceable, oddly, now than it was then, largely because, again, as a result of Spycatcher, MI5 actually issues employment contracts to its staff. Because MI5 didn't exist, it didn't, at the time of Wright, he never had an employment contract. So it couldn't plead breach of employment contract when he spilt the beans. The only other way of enforcing silence is through the Official Secrets Act. And no ifs, no buts, no maybes. Wright signed the Official Secrets Act. It was the last thing he did as he walked out of the building when he retired in 1976. And he said, I know, I must never reveal anything further. But the Official Secrets Act isn't enforceable outside the UK, which is what the government discovered to its cost in Australia. And laws in countries like Australia and indeed in Ireland say there is a public interest test. If what you reveal, even though it's a breach of confidence, reveals iniquity, and boy did Wright reveal iniquity, then no, we won't. We won't enforce confidentiality. I think what's happened is that traditional English fudge. We've done some bits, we've cleaned up other bits, we've made some bits worse, but we've polished it up and made it look a little better. And, in essence, that's almost the quintessence of the Spycatcher Affair. We've talked about it being really serious, and it was. It was a fundamentally important piece of history, and intelligence history and political history. But also, I hope if people read the book, they will enjoy this. It was a farce. It was a very English espionage farce. And what the pretzels into which the government twisted itself are so absurd that, I had trouble writing them at some point. I said, people aren't going to believe this, but here's the document which shows it. It was like something out of Alice in Wonderland.
I want to ask very quickly about the cultural impact of the Spycatcher Affair, because it's an interest of people in the Spybrary community, of fiction as well as non-fiction, and the relationship between the two. What do you think the cultural impact has been, and do you think that the world of fiction, either film or book, has really done justice to the issues raised by the Spycatcher Affair?
The last question is easy. No, I don't. I'm not a great reader of spy fiction. Great reader of fiction, but not spy fiction. And I don't find it terribly absorbing. And I have a real worry. I wrote about this in the book on Golianevsky, that what we have culturally, I think, done is glamorized espionage. Espionage isn't glamorous. Oftentimes it's dull. Other times it is banal and grubby and really not terribly honourable. It's necessary, I grant you, but terribly honourable. And yet we still cling to this Bond-like image of svelte sirens draping themselves over roulette wheels and people drinking dry martinis shaken, not stirred. It's not like that. It just isn't like that. It's dull, quiet, painstaking work, and thank God MI5 does it, because it needs to be done.
I think the best of spy fiction reflects that, actually, and I think most spy fiction, modern spy fiction, probably reflects that side of it. John le Carré, I think, was the catalyst for I think getting away from the idea of spy fiction as an adventure and trying to make it about moral ambiguity. So I think the genre's really shifted.
I think we mentioned this, you and I, before. I have more interest in Len Deighton's early spy novels than le Carré, and that fits with Spycatcher. Wright and his colleagues who are the mole hunters were viewed often as not by MI5's management as mere NCOs. They were other ranks. They weren't the officer class. And I think what I liked about Deighton's early work is that it reflects that not just the moral ambiguity, but the class divide between the old school, let's have drinks at White's and quail's eggs at Boodle's, and the the more hands-on and more dedicated, not just dedicated, it's not fair, the more hands-on and more cold-face NCOs who actually got their hands dirty. And that's why I prefer Dayton to Le Carré.
Well, I can recommend the Charlie Muffin books if you haven't read those, Brian Fremantle, because he explores a lot of the same themes of sort of class in espionage. But anyway, we have time really to sort of do justice to the cultural dimension, I think. But thank you for that answer. Can I just ask you finally one very final question? You've written a lot of non-fiction books across a very broad range of different topics. Can I ask you firstly, how do you decide what to write about? And secondly, given that your last 3 books have been about espionage, whether you'll be continuing to write more about espionage-related topics? I enjoyed your Mikhail Golyanevsky book enormously as well, by the way, because I've read that. So I'm keen for you to say yes, you will. But please tell us what's next for you.
That's kind. I'm an old journalist. I'm old and an old school journalist. And what drives me is both a good story to tell and a story, and I'm sorry if this sounds pompous, that I think needs to be told. You know, it's not just enough that it's a good tale and I can tell it. It's a good tale that needs to be told. That's what drives me. And it's driven me for the 45 years I've been a working journalist. And what's next? Well, yes, there is espionage-related. There are 2 books on the stocks. The next one, touch wood, and given a friendly publisher, will be one of the worst secrets, I think, of World War II and the Cold War, which is the recruitment by British and American intelligence services of Nazi war criminals, mass murderers and desk murderers as Cold War spies. This isn't the Operation Paperclip. This isn't the scientists. These are men who murdered multiple victims, in some cases thousands or hundreds of thousands, and British and American intelligence recruited as spies and then protected them from war crimes trials. It's taken 3.5 years to date to assemble the evidence. I'm now beginning to sift it into what will, I hope, become a book.
Well, I will be first in the queue to get that hot off the press when it comes, because that sounds fascinating. Tim, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing a really absorbing and fascinating book, which I recommend to everyone in the Spybrary community, because I think you'll get a lot out of it. It's a non-fiction book, but and it's a bit of a cliche to say this, that it reads like a thriller, but it really does read like a thriller. It's a kind of it's a gripping story, well told, which contains a lot of important new information. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for joining us, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me.